in this country, young people bear the brunt, the greatest brunt of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment. The highest unemployment is among young people. It's currently sitting at 52%. Young people who don't have matric are less likely to get employed than any other young people in this country. And yet we also have a problem of graduates that don't get employed either. Now, what I'm getting at is that young people have a stake in making sure that this country works for them, in making sure that municipalities work for them, in making sure that government actually delivers, because they're the ones suffering more than anyone else in society. So this opting out, so to speak, opting out of the system and perhaps participating in different ways that may make a noise but has very little influence and impact on what happens in government. What does that help young people? The themes that I heard coming out of the panelists were disillusionment, disempowerment. But now the question is then, how do we change the system, adapt the system to make sure that it actually works for young people, so that young people participate, so that their lives can actually change?
You don't get given power, power is taken. And I think that the issue here is that young people feel that they need to be given power. We saw actually with, I think this is what everybody quotes and everybody talks about, is the fees must fall movement, is that there was a very clear dynamic movement where you could actually see that if there was a concerted effort where people are willing to sacrifice, that certain changes could take place. And I feel that that is probably one of the things that young people need to do. They just need to take the power. They don't need to be asking for permission. And this is not me like talking about, advocating anarchy or anything like that, but sometimes, that's what it takes, for real change to take place. And I just think that, the EFF is doing a great thing, and it's really scary for a lot of people. And I would really encourage people to be more militant, because that is how we got, this is how we got our democracy to work. And we cannot constantly rely on the courts to make changes, because if you have a parliament that deliberately ignores the constitution over and over again, and you have events that constantly get challenged in the constitutional court, in the courts, and the government loses consistently, that tells you something. And what that tells you is that there is a complete disregard, I think, of the Constitution. And number two, what it tells you is that we simply cannot trust those people in power. And I think the role of the young people is also to have a continued and healthy distrust of power. And I think that because we are so trusting sometimes of power, because yes, we were brought liberation by these people, but that doesn't mean we need to trust them because they brought liberation. And that's why it is important, I think, for young people to challenge them as aggressively as they challenge the previous regime.
The organization that I work for, it's a youth development organization that challenges young people to go out into their communities, and make a difference. They identify a social issue and they take on that social issue, or the issues that they face when they try to bring about change or try to change the way perception of people, or the perception that people have around youth and abilities that youth have, is that the older generation does not want to allow them, right? And we all know that history has a way of repeating itself. Young people will start off progressively being nonviolent. Young people will start off saying, this is how we'll do things. We'll address the powers that be in a civil manner. We'll look at Martin Luther King. We'll look at Nelson Mandela before Umkhonto we was formed. The approach was quite simple. We'll approach these people in a non-violent manner. And we look at, let's also say, the Fees Must Fall campaign. Young people approach that in a non-violent manner. And there will come a time where young people will, retaliate physically, because every time we're stepping up and saying, I can't afford fees, you're retaliating with rubber bullets, you're retaliating with stun grenades. And you're right in saying that we need to take it by force. But do young people have what it takes to take it by force? That becomes the question then. Young people are in no position to give up anything. Young people are still trying to find their own mission. You know, like Frans Fanon said, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, and betray it. We as a generation find ourselves in a situation where we are not faced with one political challenge. We are faced with issues on different dynamics. We're faced with education being inaccessible. We're faced with the issue of land reform. We're faced with the racism, institutionalized racism. And as young people, we need to decide how are we going to tackle these issues first and foremost. And when we try to create platforms to do that, there's gatekeeping that we are met with, bureaucracy, red tape, and all that. So for us to be able to take things, we need to, have a platform for us to engage as young people, a platform that we completely own. And that's what made Fees Must Fall completely different from everything else, is that young people themselves used the social media that they had, and they owned that movement. So I agree with you in a sense that we need to, take it by force and not ask for permission. But I also feel as if we shouldn't just jump into conclusion and say, you know what, we should just be violent in this approach. We also need to understand that as a young generation, especially young black people, we are fighting stereotypes and saying, black people are behaving in a certain manner. Yeah, black people are ungrateful, they're lazy, they're hooligans, they vandalize everything they're given. So there is that perception. So when we try to when we try to react in such a manner, in a sense, the media will perpetuate that sense that, look at these young black people, they're being violent. You look at these young people, they're becoming hooligans, And that's how the media tends to portray certain things within our society. They tend to take a situation and find the first negative way that they can portray it. They do not, take into consideration the good that young people are doing. They do not want to listen to young people. And
if you're looking at, the generation, they were called young back then, of Mandela, they were the ones who took power from the ANC, from the elders of the ANC, and they said, actually, we taking power from you guys, and we will form Umkhonto weSizwe, right? Those are young people. And when you're looking at 1976, that generation was young. It was young people. When you're looking at, even if you're looking at the UDF in the 80s, yes, the leaders were a little bit more mature, but the people who were on the streets, who were fighting and battling out, were young people. And I think that I don't believe that it is fair to say that young people, don't want to sacrifice anything, but young people need to reach a breaking point where they will go and say that, what, actually, this is it, and then they go and fight for whatever it is they believe in. And I think the issue that you spoke about there's a perception in the media that, when black people march, they go. Therefore, we should not march and we should not be aggressive because we're afraid of what the media will say. And we should not be afraid of what the media will say. What we need to be afraid of is the fact that there's no change. And that, for me, is the biggest issue, that nothing is changing. And if we're worried about what the media is saying, when will things change? They won't. But also, I'm not saying advocating violence. It's in case, chef. So I really feel that it's important to actually understand that it is important for people to express themselves. And when you say you're taking something you're taking power, it does not always mean violence. And that is what we're always advocating. And so it's contestation of ideas. It is marching to parliament. It is, forcing people to make changes. It is not necessarily violent. Usually, the violent is provoked by the powers that be. So, like you see, the Fees Must Fall, where young people were not being violent, but they were being shot at, but they're not being violent. They're being arrested, but they're not being violent.
This discussion is characterizing young people as if they're this homogeneous group, right? And I really think it's time we get a little bit deeper because we keep talking about the Fees Must Fall campaign, for instance. The most interesting thing for me about that Fees Must Fall campaign is that, firstly, student protests were not anything new. Student protests happen every single year. But where? In the previously black universities.